Hey, what's up, guys, and welcome to Talk with Tubbs, a petrolhead's perspective. As always, I'm your host, Tapelo, aka Tubbs, and I'm going to talk you through this podcast that deals with everything motoring. We're going to talk what's new on the market, what's old on the market, what's good on the market, and also what's bad on the market. Then we're also going to delve into some motorsport, but more focused on my favorite form of motorsport, Formula One. We're going to talk driver lineups, what we feel, react, but most of all, I'm trying to give you a petrol head's perspective. Words that come from someone who's as passionate about the industry as anyone I know. So as ever, let me not waste your time. Here we go. Talk with Tubbs is a go.
Wow, it's it's been a while since I last heard the intro, and this is the first recording of 2022. This is the first time that I've decided to record a podcast since the events of Abu Dhabi last year. It's been a roller coaster, and unfortunately, well, it depends on how you look at it. Unfortunately, that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to put my voice in there, and I'm finally going to sit down and say what I think. And this is coming in so many weeks after, because I've sat down, I've looked at what the reaction has been. I've looked at how the situation has been analyzed. I've looked at how Formula One have responded to the situation. I've looked at how fans have responded to the situation. And I've seen, dare I say, patterns. I've seen common trains of thoughts. And there's just a few things I'd like to add onto that, just to, apart from giving an opinion, but just give perspective, give understanding to the way some things have played out and why it's come about in such a sense that we find ourselves in the situation that we've been. So, quick recap. Abu Dhabi, you know what happened. Dare I say, the robbery of Lewis Hamilton's eighth World Drivers' Championship, and subsequently leading to Max winning it. And the reaction was great in every sense of the word, in terms of support, in terms of scale, in terms of consistency, about how fans chose to react to the situation, but chose to call out the FIA and Formula One on what just happened. And I think from a sporting perspective, I think it's been said countless times before how sport has the power to unite, but equally sport has the power to separate. That's the word. Has the power to unite, but equally has the power to separate. And I think we found ourselves in a weird situation where the events of Abu Dhabi and the sport as a whole united, but also separated people. We were separated by a decision, but we were united in how we chose to respond to the situation. We were united by our loyalties, we were united by our fandoms, but we were also united by things that shouldn't be uniting us, and I'll get to them later, right? So we had Lewis Hamilton going dark for, I think it was 8 weeks. I'm recording this podcast after he's back, after a few of the 2022 cars have been launched, and he went quiet. Now he's back. But we also got a situation where, because of the events of Abu Dhabi, everyone was trying to read into the situation. What does the silence mean? What does it mean for the future? Could he retire? Is he going to come back? And a lot of speculation came about from that situation, in the sense that because everyone was reading into the situation and because everyone was drawing up their own conclusion, we were met with narratives that really didn't have a foundation, so to speak, but they became popular and they became dividing and they became united. Again, separating us based on a decision, but uniting us in aspects that shouldn't really be there. And it just became a huge situation. And I don't think I can emphasize enough how big the situation is from someone who's in the thick of it, as someone who is a fan, as someone who chose to dedicate time to analyzing the sport, supporting a team, supporting a person, but also someone who's just a general fan of the sport, but also from people who are neutrals, people who just watch what happened, people who are reacting to what they're seeing on social media. Because whether we like it or not, social media has become a big avenue for us to share our opinions. And it's also become a huge platform where even people who don't have any skin in the game see what's happening and they come in and opine on that. So this was big. This was big. And I want to point out a certain narrative that came about as a result of this, right? And it's how Formula One chose to play this initially. It's how journalists in Formula One chose to play this, but it's also how fans on social media chose to play this. And the situation became an us versus them. Now, depending on your loyalties and depending on how you choose to hear this podcast, you'll decide whether you're an us or them. But you'll hear as I say this, right? Throughout the season, obviously, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen being the two title rivals, that splits a lot of fans in terms of their loyalties. You had Max fans and you had Hamilton fans, and that's fine. That's something that happens in any sport. You go to football, Arsenal, Tottenham. You go to basketball, the Lakers, Heat, whatever sport there is, there's always fans on opposing sides in every game, in every competition. And that's fine. That's fine. That's a part of the sport. But the problem here is there were too many narratives attached to the support of these individual characters, and thus creating this element of an us versus them. We got Lewis Hamilton being played as, granted, the defending champ, but someone who represented a dying breed, the older guy, the guy who had to be dethroned. You had Max being touted as the wonder kid, the future, the challenger, and that those narratives attached. And then you had other narratives built onto that, in the sense that Max represented something very different to what Lewis Hamilton represented. It was no longer about their sport, but it was how we see them as people and how we see them off the track. Because the current climate in the world and in Formula One is crazy to ignore the optics of whoever's involved in a challenge, of whoever's involved in this. And when it comes to Lewis Hamilton, the undeniable fact or the undeniable optic is he is still the only black driver in Formula One. That is something you cannot ignore whenever you have a conversation about Lewis Hamilton and his involvement in Formula One. This is why people say he's bigger than sport. This is why his reach is so amplified outside of Formula One, because he doesn't only appeal to Formula One fans, he appeals to people of color, to people that have been marginalized, to people that see themselves in him. And for him to rise to the higher echelons of a sport and still be the only person of color is there, but not only be the only person of color, but be statistically the greatest driver there has ever been in Formula One, that speaks volumes, that amplifies his reach, that, dare I say, that clouds him in light, because it just makes him stick out from the crowd. You know, the tallest tree gets the most wind. I'll put it like that. And that's an element you couldn't ignore throughout the season. And this is what also created the us versus them narrative, because then what happened was the ugly side of Formula One started to come into play. Well, it's always been there, right? It's always been there in how the previous 7 of Lewis Hamilton's titles have always been clouded in a sense of disapproval, in a sense of illegitimacy, because people couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the hard work, the effort that goes into that. And granted, I'm biased, but I feel like biases aside, these are things you can see, and these are things that I am not just picking on because of my biases, but this is something that exists, and this is something I've spoken about at length before. Maybe not on the podcast, but outside of the podcast, it's a conversation I've had, in that for years and years, Lewis Hamilton's achievements, Lewis Hamilton's effort, Lewis Hamilton's titles have always been, there was always been an active effort to diminish his greatness, to diminish his effort. Whether you like him or not, look, people rub us up the wrong way and it's fine. You know, you don't have to love everyone. But you can respect someone when you view their achievements in objectivity. You can respect someone where you put personal biases aside and you look at what they're achieving. Right. So the chats on Mercedes have always had the faster car. Mercedes were dominant. Lewis Hamilton came in and he didn't do much to help the team. All those narratives, they create an us versus them, because a large portion of the sport and a large portion of the fandom of Formula One is trying to discredit Lewis Hamilton, is trying to diminish his achievements, and you have another portion that's defending him, that's trying to put logic to the situation, that's trying to highlight why he's statistically the greatest, that's trying to highlight how much work he puts in. That already creates an us versus them narrative. And you get this as well when you look at how things played out after Abu Dhabi, right? The us versus them narrative was played around so many times, so many times. You got the FIA releasing a preliminary statement saying the fans misunderstood what happened on track. That creates an us versus them. That creates us where the FIA redid what we did, them, the fans, misunderstood what happened. But that doesn't make sense. We had fans and people that have been involved in the sport for multiple years citing out what went wrong, proving what went wrong, quoting rules, regulations, precedent on why the decision that was ultimately taken was wrong. So the FIA willfully trying to weaponize the us versus them narrative created a disconnect, created a rift between the support and the sport. Again, further enhancing that us versus them narrative. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because whenever we interact with a sport, whenever we interact with an organization, it's the representatives that are closest to us that liaise our opinions with that of the sport higher up. And in this case, that job, fortunately, unfortunately, depends on the perspective, that falls onto the journalists, that falls onto commentators, that falls on people that opine on the sport, right? And this is where things went wrong. Because what happened was, as the events played out, if you watch the race live, everyone, including the commentators, including the media, including the journalists, were confused at what was happening. They couldn't understand the situation that was going on track in Abu Dhabi and the decisions that were made. They were confused by it. However, they chose to close rank. They chose to keep quiet. And I watched how a lot of journalists went about this. Initially, a lot of journalists started speaking out against Abu Dhabi after Mercedes dropped their appeal. And that was 4 days after the incident. They kept quiet for 4 days and let everything fester and didn't give an opinion and didn't give clarity or an understanding to fans or people that simply weren't knowledgeable enough to understand what was happening, right? And they kept quiet for 4 days. And only after Mercedes dropped their appeal, did journalists start giving an opinion. Which, in a sense is also right and wrong, because like I said, they are the chief liaisons between fans and the sport. They are the ones that are supposed to collate information. They are the ones that are supposed to give a voice to the voiceless, if I can put it like that. And they kept quiet. Now, they'll have their reasons for this, and some the public won't be privy to, but they kept quiet only up until then. Then the narrative was shifted to now another us versus them, and it became a Max versus Lewis Hamilton fandom, us versus them situation, right? And this is what played out for the majority of the 8 weeks after the race. It was a dare I use the labels Team LH and Team MV put up on it, and it became an us versus them situation, right? And the way in which everyone went about it is that created an even tougher narrative now, because what happened is everyone had to justify why they were saying what they were saying. It went beyond the incident in Abu Dhabi, which had wider reaching ramifications, because the certain precedents that were set in that race will have an impact on the future, will have an impact on the faith and integrity of the sport, will have an impact on how viewers interact with the sport from now on. But a lot of the narrative and a lot of the talk around it was to try and minimize the severity of the incidents in Abu Dhabi. And you get this by people quoting other scenarios in the sport that caused havoc. You look at the Nelson Piquet 2008 intentional crash. You look at Spygate with McLaren and Ferrari in 2007. While those were big issues and big events in the history of Formula One, nothing is bigger than this, because what happened in those, and look, if you follow me on Twitter, you'd know I spent a long time interacting with people on this, critiquing, giving an opinion. The difference here is those situations were between teams and drivers, and that's something that's going to happen in a sport. But here you had the body, the referee, overextending their arm and reaching into a scenario, reaching into the sport to manufacture a result. That is bigger than any situation, anything that's ever happened in the sport. This is the biggest, right? And then you had constant minimization of the severity of the situation, with people saying, well, it's in the past now, let it go. You can't let injustices go, because that's how they fester and that's how they breed another injustice. People still talk about 1989 with Senna versus Prost. People still talk about James Hunt and Niki Lauda, 1976. People still talk about Hill and Schumacher, 96. People still talk about Villeneuve and Schumacher. People still talk about Hamilton and Alonso. People still talk about Alonso and Schumacher. People still talk about Hamilton and Rosberg. I'm quoting instances within the same sport where rivalries are still a conversation to today. So why is it that this situation that happened literally a month, 2 months ago, must be minimized and it's in the past? We must stop talking about it, when it's so easy to reference things that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We're getting movies made like Rush that details the rivalry between Hunt and Niki Lauda. Those things are still things we talk about today. So why was there an effort to minimize what happened with Lewis Hamilton, the FIA, Max Verstappen, and Abu Dhabi? That's the problem. And then we went over to the conversation of, over a season, Max deserved it more, which is a really weak argument, because if they're going level on points into the same way, then it doesn't matter. You don't deserve a championship, you earn a championship. The only way to win a championship is to get more points than anyone else. That's how you earn it. So them going equal on points negates the narrative of who deserved it, who did a better job. And don't get me wrong, as I've said throughout the season, Max Verstappen was brilliant in a lot of the season. But it got to a point, and it was something I've spoken about at length last year, that he was feeling the pressure, but his team went on a mission to kind of negate that narrative, that he isn't feeling the pressure, to put up the blinkers, to say he's so relaxed in this title challenge. It's not doing anything for him. If he wins, it's a bonus, but he's just driving each week. And you saw that in how his behavior changed throughout the season, especially in the latter parts when now Mercedes were proving to be the faster car. You know, you saw him changing his driving standards. We know he's an aggressive driver, and I've spoken at length about how dangerous I feel he is, but we got to a point where now his aggression was over the mark and he wasn't punished for it. That showed a certain bias in the way things were working out. There was proof of things, and even the penalties he got had no lasting impact, and that's not how it should be. If incidents and contraventions go against the rules and sporting regulations, then you have to treat them as such. We can go into the semantics and the specifics of every decision that was made, but a few rise up to the top. How he wasn't punished in Brazil for pushing Hamilton off the track, his driving standards in Saudi Arabia, the corner cutting, the incidences, the brake check, things that would equally constitute much harsher penalties, considerably even a disqualification from a race, but that were not done. And then you get to Abu Dhabi and you get a manufactured result. And I say manufactured because what's happening is a lot of people are ignoring, and I said this very, very soon after the event in Abu Dhabi, that the fact that one lap of racing was forced will forever leave the rhetoric, because in our view, what we saw was Max Verstappen overtaking Lewis Hamilton on the last lap of the race. And that's what people saw. So to tell a person that was manufactured, they're like, well, I saw him overtake. That video is being circulated so many times as a rebuttal, as a deterrent, as a defense against the manipulation that we talk about. We being Lewis Hamilton fans, we being people that feel there was willful manipulation in terms of willfully misinterpreting the rules of the sport. Whenever we bring up that topic, the video is put up as defense, but he overtook him. Yes, he did, but you cannot ignore what happened in the 55, 56 laps before that. Yes, the safety car is a part of the game. It's a risk you have to play. It's something that comes up. The issue is not the safety car. The issue is the contravention of the rules relating to the safety car and lapped cars. I won't go into that. You can read up on it. It's been everywhere. What I'm trying to point out is that the situation was willfully minimized by pointing out those instances that made it seem like the situation was just normal when it really wasn't. And now that Lewis Hamilton has hinted that he's coming back to the sport, you're seeing the narrative change now. No longer is it about Lewis Hamilton holding the sports ransom. No longer is it about Lewis Hamilton being a sore loser. But now people are saying, well, do you know what? What actually happened in Abu Dhabi was not right. You're getting other drivers coming out and saying that. You're getting the journalists that shut ranks once upon a time coming out and saying this. But now what's happening is the journalists are also trying to feed into the us versus them narrative by trying to shift the goalpost. Well, Michael Massey wasn't working alone. Why is Michael Massey being targeted? Because he's the one who made the decision, my friend. But you're getting that, trying to put an us and a them situation. And now you have to look at it in terms of a Lewis Hamilton perspective and his fans' perspective, right? Because what happens is Lewis Hamilton has been very outspoken about what he believes in. And I have no problem with that. Every driver exists outside of a sport. They don't exist in a vacuum of only Formula One. So their opinions and stuff, they are entitled to. They are entitled to the freedom to express what they support, what they'd like to see change. That's fine. And it takes courage to do that, because we all know that whenever you speak about something you're passionate about and whenever you represent something, criticism follows. And it's not everyone that can stomach or shoulder the burden of that criticism. So people like Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, speaking up for the LGBTQ plus community, speaking up about Black Lives Matter, speaking up about certain injustices, that's a brave effort on their part, and it's something to be commended. However, then you see the us versus them narrative come back to the fore, in the sense that Lewis Hamilton is criticized for his beliefs. He's criticized for movements that he feels strongly about. I, as a fan, don't wholly agree with everything he says. We're just different people. But I can try and see the perspective with which he comes with, right? That's just what you do when you engage with someone's belief, when you engage with someone, period. You try and see where they come from. With Lewis Hamilton, he's never been afforded the freedom to speak his mind in the way that other drivers have. And certain things just came up to mind as I was preparing this podcast, in that the things Lewis Hamilton speaks about are opinions or similar chains of thought that other drivers have had the opportunity to speak about, and they have, but the reaction to them is not the same. The standards for Lewis Hamilton are very different in how things play out in Formula One. James Hunt was a very outspoken character against apartheid in South Africa back then. He's still lauded as a great in Formula One. People still love him. People still compare Lewis Hamilton to him, but neglect that this is a very similar chain of thought, a very similar belief that they held. But that's the reaction to what James Hunt was and what Lewis Hamilton is very different. Lewis Hamilton gets criticized, gets abused for his beliefs, while people like James Hunt get praised. Ayrton Senna spoke out multiple times about the direction that Formula One was following, how he felt about the commercialization of Formula One, how he felt about the fact that money was becoming bigger than talent. Money was becoming a driver in who got to drive the cars, which team got the most resources. He's spoken about this and he was praised for it. Lewis Hamilton speaks about the disparity of resources. He wants to push black people into the sport, and he's ridiculed for that. He is abused for that. Similar chain of thought, but the reaction is not the same. It's not the same. And I'm not talking about when Senna was doing this. I'm talking about people speaking about it now. Now, I'm talking, these things are happening live as we speak. Kimi Räikkönen is often praised for how nonchalant he is about Formula One. The clip of him in Drive to Survive saying Formula One is just a hobby. It's played up so well. He's praised for that. And fine, granted, right? But why is it that when other people express passion, for them it's a problem? And Lewis Hamilton has spoken at length about conservation, about veganism, about climate change, about the LGBTQ. And he was criticized and racist abuse was thrown at him, like when he put rainbows on his helmet. But when Sebastian Vettel did it, he was praised. When he was pictured picking up litter, he was praised. When he was pictured wearing a Same Love t-shirt, he was praised. Lewis Hamilton does the same things and he gets abuse. What I'm trying to highlight here is that the standards are different. And fortunately, or unfortunately, we know why. A lot of us know why the standards are different. And it's an undeniable fact you get when you look at the difference between all those other drivers and Lewis Hamilton. His skin color speaks more to people than his actual words, than his actual mentality. His skin color is the determinant in how people perceive him instead of his actions. People often say actions speak louder than words, but unfortunately in this case, his skin tone is speaking larger than everything else. And we see this in how often he gets racist abuse on social media, how often he gets ridiculed, how often everything that happens to him, the foundation for a lot of the time is rooted in racism. People will speak about his dominance, 7 titles, his dominance. Michael Schumacher has that, and he is praised for being so dominant. He is praised for being so good. The faster car narrative doesn't make sense because, like in any football, in any sport, to achieve, your resources have to be better than the competition. Football teams spend a lot of money to make sure that they are better. Teams spend a lot of money to make sure that they are better. Michael Schumacher winning in a Ferrari is not a fluke. It's surrounding yourself with resources that make it possible. So Lewis Hamilton winning in a Mercedes is no different to all these other drivers that have dominated the sport. It's simply an accumulation and strategy of resources to create a situation where you're better than the opposition. Now, the faster car narrative has always been weaponized against Lewis Hamilton. But when Max Verstappen and Red Bull had an R16B that was faster than Mercedes for 75% of the season, the faster car narrative was now wrong. The faster car narrative was now wrong because it could no longer be used to weaponize against Lewis Hamilton, but it could be used to weaponize against another driver. Now it didn't matter. Now you had publications making sure to analyze each and every sector of each and every race on each and every tire compound on each and every driver to try and prove that Mercedes were not slow, to try and prove that Mercedes still had a fast car. No one is disputing they had a fast car. It's just that Red Bull had a faster car. But you had an active effort to try and minimize that difference. It's so impossible to ignore the narratives that Lewis Hamilton has to contend with. And he showed the ultimate act of grace by not fighting when he had the win stolen from him. On that day, in that race, in those moments, Lewis Hamilton did more than anyone in the sport has ever had to do. He showed the ultimate level of sportsmanship. He showed the ultimate level of respect to an organization that has literally spat in his face, to a team that has literally abused him, to a team that has thrown abuse his way, to a team that has questioned his stature, that has questioned his character. He showed respect to each and every one of those people, him and his father. But that was put aside when he went quiet. That created an us against them narrative. And if you don't believe me, check how the term Team LH or they're gonna come for this has been weaponized on social media. That's an us versus them narrative. So looking into the new season, if he's coming back, I'm overjoyed, but I'm equally, it's incomprehensible how strong his mentality is, how high his confidence is to come back and still try and prove something. Many of us would have left after that. Many of us would not be there because it takes a different kind of person to fight when seemingly everyone is against you. I was listening to Trevor Noah on The Daily Show recently, and he put this into context by saying the problem with the racism these days is that racism is often attached to certain keywords, the N-word, the K-word, all those racial slurs, right? And that's how people justify racism. Oh, well, I didn't use that word, so I'm not racist. But the problem is people don't use those words to be racist anymore. So it's tough to point out racism. For people that are on the receiving end of racism, we know what it is. We know what it feels like. We can see it even when it's not visible. But for other people, if it doesn't have those keywords, the N-word, the K-word, whatever other word you want to use, they don't get it. And this is something that's been so difficult to emphasize to the community about why Lewis Hamilton continuing to race season after season, race after race, and holding his head up high, being booed at every single race of the season bar one. That just shows something in him. And I know this was supposed to be a critique of how things have played out. I couldn't help but praise Lewis Hamilton because unfortunately, he is the party that was disadvantaged by everything that happened. What did Max do wrong so that his championship should be taken away? What did Lewis Hamilton do wrong? Over the past 4 races, I've never seen a driver, an athlete, pull themselves from the depths of despair to become triumphant, to overcome so many narratives that were stacked against you, disqualifications, racist abuse, criticism, ridicule, unfair allegations of other things, to still overcome that and be inch perfect. We often say that perfection doesn't exist, but Lewis Hamilton over the last 4 or 5 rounds of the Formula One 2021 season was perfect. He lost that championship from factors that were outside of his control. He was robbed of something he had worked hard to achieve. He was robbed of his perfection. That's why you cannot keep quiet about what happened in Abu Dhabi. That's why this conversation will always cloud and hang over the Formula One community. That's why Formula One 2021 will always be tainted. That's why Max Verstappen's first title will always have an asterisk next to it. That's why there's so much pressure on the FIA to correct and release a report that actually has repercussions for those that were involved. That's why there's not a lot of hype over the new cars. That's why this cloud, this responsibility, this burden is hanging over the sport, is hanging over the fans, is hanging over the journalists, is hanging over the organizing body. That's why journalists are crumbling. That's why journalists are changing their narrative. That's why fans are at each other's throats. That's why the us versus them narrative exists. Because one person simply walking onto the grid is a threat to everyone and every established precedent that exists in the sport. That's why there will never be silence over what happened on the 12th of December, 2021. That's why Formula One is in the trouble that it currently finds itself in. That's why. Thank you so much for tuning in. Like I said, I won't be uploading podcasts on a regular, but this is one I felt I needed to make because this is my definitive statement on what happened at the end of Formula One 2021. The whole season didn't matter up until that point. Up until that point, nothing that happened before mattered because in that moment, everything that happened before lost meaning, lost significance because of one decision that ruined everything.